I might steal a cube. I don't know.
Wow, look at that thing. I wish you could see this cube, Fred. The biggest cube you've ever seen in your life.
Are there some of the famous
Novelty
cubes around?
Yeah.
There's one at least. Maybe there's more. Maybe there's like a cube hunt going on backstage.
Oh, please let there be a cube hunt going on. My favorite kind of thing is a cube hunt. You guys ever seen a cube this big? Let me hear it. Listen to that crowd.
How did we do, Fred?
All right, well then, let's begin this episode of Lucky Paper Radio. My name is Andy. I am here, as always, with my co-host, Anthony, comboed off so hard in the Turbo Cube that his opponent called an Uber and left Maddox.
Look, that's just winning. That's how we do it here.
Round one. It was round one, and your opponent said, you know what, I think I'm just done, and I'm going to go ahead and leave.
I don't know if that was strictly my fault. They made some other excuses. I'm sorry. I'm very sorry to my round one opponent.
I didn't witness it, but word on the street is that you just comboed off so hard that they scooped in a much broader sense.
Mm-hmm. Look, the Turbo Cube isn't for everybody. If you don't go in with the right expectations, it can be a little punishing.
What specifically did you do?
So, I was playing a green-white combo deck. I had both Heliod and Ballista and Monoscallion, and I also had Farmstead Gleaner.
Heliod does work with Monoscallion in the Turbo Cube only, right?
Correct. Yeah, it's a weird thing to say, like, oh, I have this combo deck, because it, only works in the Turbo Cube. So it's been funny that
Well, Heliod and Walkie Ballista works everywhere.
Sure.
But Monoscallion does work only because of the Turbo rules modification.
Farmstead Gleaner and Pathway Arrows. That's a Turbo Cube exclusive.
Farmstead Gleaner,
I always
Pathway
will take
Arrows.
one of those pieces because why not? And then I also had a bunch of redundancy. We just talked about tutors the other day, and I had Stoneforge Mystic and Recruiter and a couple other ways to get the pieces. It was a cool deck. I only went 1-2. I lost in my final match to somebody who turn 1'd me twice. And I gotta say, that is a funny experience to, finish mulligans and then kind of like make a plan, and then your opponent's just like, you lose. And you're like, I guess I just shuffle this hand away now and just draw a new hand.
I was really excited to see the big smile on Emma's face, and even more excited when I realized that they were employing the combo that I discover. I mean, I'm
Brand
sure
new combo.
I think they discovered it independently because
Yes.
I don't think they saw me having discovered it
independently during that game.
Oh, great. This is the combo, of course, the combo everyone knows. Of Archaeomender and Synod
Sanctum, I think it's
Synod
called.
Sanctum, right. Synod Sanctum, which just allows you to continue to rebuy the Synod Sanctum and the Archaeomender over and over again, and then profit? ?
And then Aetherflux Reservoir. I passed that reservoir, and I said, I'm going to lose to this, I know, if I let it go. But that was not what I was doing in my deck, and I think I really needed fixing or something.
Yeah. Anyway, I was so glad to see Emma's big smile on her face when she just... comboed you twice on turn one, which I gotta say, for all that the Turbo Cube is, powerful and degenerate, that's not that common. It's pretty uncommon to get turned one, and it's extremely uncommon to get turn one back to back.
And it was also not like here I put these two cards on the table and I combo out. It was like...
There aren't really any combos like that. I mean...
Right, except for the two that I had.
That's true, actually, yeah.
But... Yeah, she was like, I think I can win. I just have to draw my entire deck here, so give me a second to figure out
I have
how
to draw
do
my
this.
entire deck, most of which I can cast for free.
Yeah. Turbo Cube. What a weird cube.
It is a weird cube, Anthony. And some might say it's a novel cube.
I
or
would
a bit of a
describe it
novelty.
as such.
This has been on my mind, and it's what I want to discuss in this episode, because I have been, as listeners to recent episodes know, kind of wholly focused on the 100 Ornithopters cube, which we to date have drafted twice. 2 Ornithopters have been named. And I've been thinking a lot about that cube.
Should we reveal that I 3-0'd and you 3-0'd, so we are truly the champions of the Ornithopter cube?
Yes, according to Dan, it is rigged that we won consecutive drafts. I did 1-2 the first draft, though, so I bombed pretty hard, and then brought it back the second
Don't worry
draft.
about that one.
Yeah, so far, winning record on my career. I'm 4-2 on my career in the Ornithopter Cube. But anyway, I've been thinking about it a lot. It's been my primary design focus. The Bun Magic Cube's on the back burner, the Degenerate Micro Cube's on the back burner, though I have a couple things I'm brewing there kind of passively. And I've been thinking a lot about this idea of novelty cubes because I have seen this diverse reaction to the 100 Ornithopters Cube when people see it for the first time. Which is to say that...
I feel like I've only seen positive reactions, so what's the negative reaction
There's
look
been
like?
a lot of positive reactions, a lot of people that are just like, what a cool idea, I'm excited to see what this does. They look at the list and like, all of the conglomerated like weeks and months of me finding cards that fit perfectly in that environment, like they get to experience it in like a brief moment when they look at the visual spoiler and like, oh, look at that and that and that, and they like realize all the things that you can do. And I think it's really cool and exciting to like look at it that way. And the response has overwhelmingly been positive, but there's definitely a big chunk of people which I wouldn't even call it a negative response. They're just like, yeah, not for me. Right? Not for me, right? Which is totally fair. And there's no expectation that any cube anybody designs should be for everybody. But I myself have felt that before about cubes that I would describe as being a novelty or having a gimmick. A gimmick is another word that we can use here to describe this idea, where something about the cube is so different, so new, hence the etymology of the term novelty, that it kind of becomes what the whole cube is about, right? Novelty is often used as a pejorative because it kind of means that the only thing that is significant or meaningful about this thing is that it is new. It offers no other intrinsic value. It's not actually a good version of the thing. It's just one you haven't seen before. It's a like novel new thing. And I've been trying to wrestle with, in this world we're living in now, where more and more people are designing different kinds of cubes with different types of goals, where that line is between a novelty cube and just a cube with different goals that you've communicated effectively.
Yeah, I mean, I think that novelty definitely implies, I think, a lack of depth is the best way to put it, where it's like, this isn't going to be something intrinsically that's going to stand up on its own merits. It's just going to be, it's a ice cube tray that's a funny shape or bigger than you expect, and it's not the most practical ice cube tray, but it's cool because it just is a little fancy for something different.
Yeah, not to be the Webster's Dictionary defines blank as.
But please don't do that.
But the first line of the Wikipedia page for a gimmick is a novel device or idea designed primarily to attract attention or increase appeal, often with little intrinsic value. And I think there's a lot of people that could very justifiably write off the 100 Ornithopters cube, the Turbo Cube, the Degenerate Micro Cube, Keldon's Bolt Cube, the Descent into Avernus Cube, all of these really interesting new ideas for cube designs, and just look at them and say, well, my assumption is that it's got this thing to draw my attention, right? The 100 Ornithopters is purely a gimmick just to like make it easy to market and draw my attention, and the presumption is that if you actually played this 5, 10, 20 times, it would be not deep, not interesting. It wouldn't have the same, intrinsic value that in this community we recognize a like cube to have, where it's interesting to draft and play over and over again and like learn and get better at.
Yeah, I mean, in my experience, it's just been kind of really difficult to just look at a list or read somebody's cube description and tell if something's going to have legs. We were talking last week about sort of like when we were at peak cube, kind of right around when the pandemic started, and I was definitely in a mode where I was like, okay, what if we just start doing really weird stuff, and I'm going to design a different cube every month, and we're going to draft it one time. And I
like how the weirdest you got was, all the cards are only black.
Well, then the pandemic happened, so some of the weirder ideas did not happen. But yeah, Monoblack Cube, it was interesting. It was novel. It was like fun to try it once or twice, but didn't really capture, didn't have the longevity and that depth that you'd want from something that you're going to draft again and again. The Turbo Cube, on the other hand, I also expected to be purely a novelty that we'd try once or twice, and turned out that was pretty interesting.
Though I feel like if it was left up to just you would have maybe written that off and then just not drafted it again. I think you were kind of caught off guard by the broad excitement and interest in drafting that cube repeatedly in our local play group.
Yeah, I mean, it's also just really fun to open up packs in that cube and be like, wow, look at all this crazy stuff I can do.
Well, that's one thing that I was thinking about, is that I think for a lot of these novel cubes, these new, more radical departures from what a cube is, a ton of the excitement is in the drafting and deck building. And then, especially the first couple times you draft it, the gameplay might be, well, I didn't really know exactly what was going on here, or how to evaluate this environment. I mean, even people that end up going 0-3 in their first draft of the Turbo Cube are really excited after the draft and during deck building, because they're like, look what my deck can do. And you're like, that's true. Mm-hmm. Wait till you see what other decks can do.
Exactly.
But tasting that novelty, that like new thing, is inherently exciting. And I think that, I guess I'm trying to grapple with how to, determine if a cube has the kind of depth and intrinsic value that grows beyond its gimmick or novelty, and B, if I think a cube does have that, how to communicate that to people. Because I was going down the list of novelty items and gimmicks on Wikipedia, and there's a big overlap between novelty items and gimmicks and things that are basically like fads, right? Like things that are really successful for a little while. Actually, I think this sentence on Wikipedia is suggesting that,
wow, we're really going deep on two white guys reading Wikipedia page on the podcast.
Look, I did my prep. Sorry. I think this sentence on Wikipedia is actually suggesting that the first things to be described as novel in this specific nuanced sense were dances, novelty dances. Think like the Macarena, the YMCA, or go all the way back to the Charleston or whatever, right? These dances that like, here's a new way we can dance, and that like takes off and has a moment in the sun, and then it's like, okay, well, we're not all going to do that for the rest of time. And, I'm not a professional dancer, but I would imagine a professional dancer would suggest that the Macarena or the electric slide or whatever doesn't have a lot of deep intrinsic value to the dance community, though I don't want to put words in their mouth. With the 100 Ornithopters Cube, I had the stupid idea, which at the time was purely a gimmick. I didn't even think it would be a cube anybody would ever draft. It was a gimmick to make this guy laugh on Twitter. Shout out to Morgan if you're listening. And I stuck really hard to the gimmick because it was a gimmick. I was like, okay, exactly 100 Ornithopters, because 100 is a round number. Is that the right number for the like deep intrinsic value of like the repeated draftability of this environment? I had no idea, but 100 Ornithopters is a really catchy little name. And I also stuck really hard to the idea that you couldn't win a game in any other way. There are no other creatures. There are no ways to make creature tokens. There are no creature lands. There's no ways to deal direct damage that don't involve also sacrificing an Ornithopter. I leaned really, really hard into the gimmick in a way that you and I before have, I think, been very critical of people that commit really hard to some restriction, right? Where it's like, oh, I'm a pauper cube and I refuse to let myself play this otherwise perfect uncommon because I'm a pauper cube and I only play commons. And we're like, look, just make your, like, you found the right card for your cube. Who cares if it, isn't within this, like, restriction? And to the same end, like, I should be telling myself, like, just put Argothian Enchantress in the cube. It's a 0/1 with Shroud. Yeah, technically there are ways you could pump it. You could have Assault Formation in play and then pump it a bunch of times. You could maybe kill somebody with your Argothian Enchantress, but it's got a worse body than the Ornithopter. It costs mana. Like, it would just be another Enchantress effect, which I desperately want for that cube is another Enchantress effect, because the only one I can run, given that I run no other non-Ornithopter creatures, is Enchantress's Presence, which I think is pretty good, but I would love another one. So that's a spot where you say, like, look, give up on your stupid hard commitment to this bit and instead make a good cube. But I do also feel like fundamentally, a cube is a thing that needs to market itself. And if I can't sit down to a table of new drafters and say, the only creatures in this cube are Ornithopters, it's going to dramatically change their perceptions of the environment, how they approach their sort of first draft of the cube, and their initial experience. So I feel like all these things are really tied together, and in some sense, it almost seems like if you have an idea for a cube that is sticky enough to be well-received and popular, that like pushes it over the edge and just like, well, now it's just a novelty. Like it's just a gimmick because everyone seems to be excited about it, right?
Yeah, I mean, I would say more than just putting it in the framework of like marketing itself. I think that just setting clear expectations is really, really important to having people have a good time, so they sort of like know what is going to happen.
I do think it goes beyond that, though. Like,
yeah, no, I think both these things are true, but I think that, yeah, when you say, like, this is the gimmick of this cube, is all about Ornithopters, that's how you have to win, as soon as somebody sees the Argothian Enchantress, they kind of have to reevaluate, like, wait a minute, like, is this actually the gimmick, or are there other creatures I'm going to see that I'm not expecting? So I think that having that really clear restriction and sticking to it makes a lot of sense for creating that experience. And I think when we've been critical in the past, it's less about if you throw one rare into your pauper cube, is that going to throw things off? Probably not. And if this is the cube you're drafting again and again with the same people that you like already know the environment, then the restriction isn't necessarily providing that support in the same way. So yeah, I mean, I think that loosening up on those restrictions definitely makes a lot more sense in some contexts.
Yeah, and on the flip side, like, your regular cube has gotten popular because of this show, because it's a well-designed cube. But I do actually think that its popularity has been significantly hindered by the fact that it doesn't have a way to describe it. It's
definitely.
Like if you had designed a pauper cube or a peasant cube, I mean, that cube is, I think, in its play patterns, very peasant feeling, right? You avoid cards that have a like rare style impact on the game in most instances.
Yeah.
So it's kind of like a peasant cube play patterns with a few dozen rares, however many. You probably have quite a few in there, but a lot of them are like indistinguishable from uncommons in terms of their power level or impact on the game. But I think if you had a way to like describe that in a more concise way, I think the cube would be even more popular than it is now, because it would have a sort of hook. And, you know, it's easy for us with the podcast to say that, like, you know, we think about how popular a cube is, right? But I think that is a direct correlation to how it translates to a local play group. Like, people ask for the Turbo Cube all the time because it's like, what do you want to draft this week? And people are thinking about the types of cubes in their head. And the Turbo Cube is just, you can have a clear conception of it in your brain. Like it's a coherent idea that has been clearly communicated. And that has a lot of value, I think, in just how players approach it.
I agree. And that's also not totally unintentional.
Oh, you're a hipster.
Yep.
You don't want people to like you.
The hook of my main cube is that there is no hook. It's just good, clean magic, and that's it.
But even calling it like the good, clean magic cube would be a lot better than the regular cube.
Yeah, but that was funny to me at the time.
So anyway, I'm rethinking my commitment to this restriction in this context, and I still feel pretty strongly that Argothian Enchantress would undermine a fundamental aspect of the cube, both in how it's explained, discussed, perceived, and also kind of how it's played, even though I do think it wouldn't change. It's not like, okay, the person who has Argothian Enchantress is just killing you with Argothian Enchantress now. They still have to be an Ornithopter deck, right? But there's something about the clarity of that idea. The same way that if I realized, the right number of Ornithopters is actually 107, I would just say, screw it. Too bad. We're sticking with 100 because it's so much more valuable to this cube as a whole entity, which... thinking about the entire life cycle of drafting a cube, where it goes not just from 8 players sitting at a table to the end of the rounds when you have 1-3-0 and 1-0-3, but from we have a whole play group with lots of different cubes, and we have this cube night where there's going to be 25 people milling around, and you have to explain what each cube is in a brief explanation so that you can get some people to come sit at the table. Which, everyone listening to this cube night might be different, but the same way that you're posting on your local Discord channel about wanting to draft something, I think that how the cube is explained to people is a huge part of what the cube is. And so I don't feel at this juncture like I want to sacrifice that commitment to the bit, but I don't feel like it's purely a shallow gimmick either.
Yeah, I definitely don't think you should. Although on the number of Ornithopters, I think you could be a little bit flexible because you could put in some more Ornithopters and no one's counting them.
They're literally numbered.
But don't worry about it. Put in 2 Ornithopter 34s. It'll be fine.
It's an interesting suggestion, but no, I feel committed to it.
Okay.
I feel committed to it. So, do you feel like the Monoblack Cube was a gimmick and the Turbo Cube is something deeper?
I think that the gimmick of the Turbo Cube maybe just pays off a little bit better. We've been talking about this for this whole episode, but in the Turbo Cube, all spells and abilities cost 2 generic mana less, and that is just a proposition which does deliver an exciting draft experience more than the restriction of this is just black cards, which was cool, but there just wasn't necessarily a payoff in the same way. It's like, okay, I'm thinking more about zombies now, and does it change things that my enchantments and artifacts aren't going to get disrupted? A little bit, but not that much. So you're definitely giving up a lot by imposing some kind of hard restriction like that, and just the scales weren't balanced in a way that actually made the Monoblack Cube really pay off.
So it's not a matter of one of these restrictions being fundamentally different. It's just that the Turbo Cube's more exciting.
Yeah, it's just more fun.
It is really fun, to be fair. After the first 2 drafts of the Ornithopter Cube, I feel like there's a lot of excitement in the draft for the reasons mentioned, right? You open a pack, and you see a bunch of cards, many you've probably never even seen before, none of which you've probably considered in this new context, and you're like, oh, Aura Shards is kind of broken, and oh, Plum of the Forbidden is also kind of broken, I think. It is very good here, I think. And that excitement, I think, carries a lot of the first draft experience, right? Kind of similar to the Turbo Cube. Even if you draft a deck and go 1-2, you got exposed to all this new and exciting power. Honestly, I think a lot of this comes down to whether you want to admit it or not. The fact that these things end up being more powerful in these contexts in an absolute sense than other Magic cards in other draft environments, right? Like the Monoblack Cube did not turn any cards into powerhouses, right?
Yeah.
It just...
Except for Mimic Fat. Maybe another way to think about it, I know Mark Rosewater talks a lot about how if you want your theme to be a theme, you have to have it at common. You need for when players open a pack, it is the thing they see every time. And I think that applies to cube drafts as well. When people are sitting down at the table, drafting a new cube for the first time, you want them to see what the thing is all about. And in the Turbo Cube, I've got the emblem printed out on the table, and they can look at every single card is fundamentally transformed by that. So there is this immediate impact of this is a different pack and it's going to be a different experience. And I think the Ornithopter Cube does the same thing because every pack you open has 3 to 6 Ornithopters in it. So
sometimes many more.
Sometimes more. So it's you open up that pack and it's asking a question of you immediately. It's okay, here's the Ornithopter Cube. You're looking immediately at Ornithopters. They have no power. How are you going to deal 20 damage to your opponent? And from that framework, then you're looking at the rest of the pack and saying, okay, well, this puts one of the counters on them, or this lets me sacrifice them to do something, or this generates card advantage, which maybe I can translate into a win. So you immediately see in that first pack what is the problem that you're trying to solve, which is killing people with your creatures with no power.
Yeah, I had a funny experience in the most recent draft where it was pack 3 and I had been a little bit not disciplined on taking my Ornithopters. It's funny, in that cube, I think eating your vegetables is drafting your Ornithopters, because
Yeah, I felt that tension where I was constantly like both trying to figure out how many do I want in my deck at the end, and how highly do I need to pick them to get to that number.
Yeah, but in the third pack, I was like, I really need a couple more Ornithopters, but this card's really good for my deck. And I was like, what are the chances I wheel an Ornithopter out of this pack? And I was like, oh, 100%. There are 8 Ornithopters in this pack. I will 100% wheel an Ornithopter so I can take this card safely and know that I'm going to get an Ornithopter pack.
But you could have gotten 2 Ornithopters out of it.
I could have, yes. I made the assessment that whatever card it was worth more to me. Yes, and I think that's actually what I am most excited about the Ornithopter Cube, again, is that I think it has that same feeling of novelty, and I say that in a non-pejorative sense, that feeling of like newness, a brand new context in which to evaluate cards, but it gets there not by modifying any rules. It gets there purely by cards included in the cube list itself, which I think is elegant compared to all these other cubes you and I both designed that have some other like external thing, right? Where your deck size is 15 or all your spells cost 2 less. This is like, no, just open the pack, just draft. Just look at it and like you will see and feel what this is all about.
Yeah. I mean, if I would also compare that experience to the experience of opening up a pack of the Monoblack Cube, it was like, yeah, I get the theme here. All these cards are black, but it didn't ask a question or sort of prompt you to start thinking about things in a different way to the same degree. It was just like, okay, all these cards are the same color.
It just prompted all of your drafters to tell you put in Withering Boon and Phyrexia's Gate.
Yep.
Phyrexia's Core? Not the land.
Gate to Phyrexia.
Gate to Phyrexia, that's the one. It's a rare mono-black artifact removal spell.
Hopes.
Yeah, not good. Yeah, so a lot of the excitement is in the draft for those reasons, which begs the question, if we're talking about this definition of a gimmick or a novelty item is something that has like a idea to get attention, but that kind of masks a lack of intrinsic value. Is the intrinsic value in a cube draft the games?
I don't know. I mean, I like drafting. I feel like drafting is almost as much fun as playing the game sometimes. So
I know what
like
Ryan Sachs would say. Ryan Sachs would not say the fun is in the games necessarily, because Ryan Sachs has said many times he would just like to draft a bunch of decks back to back and just look at them and decide who wins and then go again, or have like an auto battler run the matches out for him. But I think that there is a little bit of stigma's the wrong word. It was a little bit of an idea that like you should be aiming for good games, and then like the draft is like a means to an end. When I think in a lot of these cubes cases, the draft is a lot of the fun. And I think part of that is just that of an entire night of drafting a cube and playing 3 matches, the draft is generously a quarter of the time you spend doing that, probably more like a fifth of the time you spend. So if the draft is the fun part, and then you have 4/5 of the night is not the fun part, that's probably not a great breakdown. But I do think there's something to the idea that a cube where the draft can be dramatically different each time, and the draft is like the novel, interesting bit, and then the games are more like, okay, let's put that idea that I had in the draft to the test, right? And let's, even if the games are not the same kind of like decision-rich games that I've described seeking in the Bun Magic Cube, or that I know you seek in the regular cube, where it's like good, clean magic, the board state matters, your life total matters, tempo matters, sequencing matters, like maybe all those things don't matter as much, but the games can still have value as a means of like testing a hypothesis of like, can I build a deck that is trying to mill itself out in Hunter Ornithopter Cube and then win with Gaia's Blessing, right? Is that a thing that can work here? It's a different framing, because I guess another way to look at this is, what do you think are the most extreme limited sets in all time in this regard? Like the limited sets that are the biggest departures from what players have otherwise come to recognize as like normal limited.
I mean, is it cheating to say like the conspiracy sets or the unsets with like you're drafting a separate
Let's say
contraption?
Yes, that's cheating. I mean, those are a gimmick in and of themselves, right? Like they're essentially the gimmick cubes of the official WotC product,
right,
where it's like, this is not real magic. Either the borders are silver, or we have a bunch of cards that don't work in constructed or whatever that are just for this environment.
But maybe you're allowed to draft them in a vintage roto draft. We don't know.
maybe. No, putting those aside, like, and you and I have not played every limited set. We haven't been playing a lot of limited over the past couple of years, but like, do you have an immediate, this set seems way different? Like, wasn't there some Alara set where like all the cards were gold or something? Or
yeah, I feel like That's actually an interesting point that I feel like the core sets, not literally the core sets, but the main, what do you call them, the premier sets are pretty consistent and focused these days. They're not necessarily doing these wild things like, what was it, like Legends was only creatures, and yeah, Alara was all
Legends is
multicolored.
only creatures, really?
Not Legends, Legion.
Legion was only
Legions.
creatures?
I believe so. Which meant they just sort of like made a bunch of creatures with ETBs and morphs that flip up and do stuff in order to still make it get all the effects that you would expect to have. But they've been pretty consistent lately in terms of their structure. And by lately, I mean for the last 15 years.
How did I never know that Legions was all creatures?
It's hard to notice what's not there.
Wow. I mean, I'm just looking at the whole set spoiler right now, and yeah, the whole dang set. Wild.
Are there even any lands in there?
Are there any lands in Legions? No. It is literally all... It's what was a small set back in the day. It's only 145 cards, but every single card is a creature. Yeah, and then there's like... Is it Torment or... Torment that's more black?
Torment was
like
more
it leans
black.
heavily
Yeah.
black?
Yeah.
So there have been some more radical departures from what like a main expansion looks like in terms of limited, but it's been a while since they've done anything more than like, a pretty good mix of creatures and spells. It feels like all of the novelty in modern sets is just purely mechanical. It's like, oh, we have these new mechanics. And to be fair, a lot of the new mechanics are much more complicated than old mechanics, so to combine that with a like radical limitation or radical gimmick on the overall set itself might be just overwhelming. But yeah, I think Wizards has kind of narrowed in on, and to be fair, I've heard nothing but praise for limited sets of the past 4 years. People have said they've been the best limited sets of all time. So I think they've really narrowed in on what they want limited to be, and we're kind of just getting different flavors almost of the same type of limited with each set that has some mechanical differences. And obviously the rankings of colors are going to like move around, and the speed's going to be a little bit different, but we're really kind of getting flavors of a similar thing compared to the range of what would be possible, right? Of just radically changing the expectations for what is in a pack of Magic cards.
Definitely. I mean, the most recent thing that feels like pretty extreme is maybe Mirrodin being very heavily artifacts, but even that was not recent.
I was going to say maybe War of the Spark.
Sure, that's
with
actually a great point, yeah.
a bunch of Planeswalkers, although functionally they played a lot like enchantments because they realized they couldn't have a bunch of Planeswalkers in the same board complexity sense that typical Planeswalkers prior to that set would exist. But even that was not that. I mean, it was extreme in terms of looking at like the density of Planeswalkers overall, but that was a set I played a lot of limited of, and it did not feel that different. It was like, okay, well,
Proliferate's good,
I guess, and it'll be a slightly slower games, but it wasn't like it was a radical shift. And I feel like maybe that, I don't say narrowness, it sounds like I'm being pejorative saying that there's a narrow sense of what limited is these days, but that like focus is a better word, that like focus on a certain type or range of acceptable gameplay for retail limited, I think contributes to the idea that any cube that is outside of those borders is weird and maybe not worth its value for that reason.
Yeah, that's a good point, and I feel like that actually informs the way a lot of people, if they're not doing something more typical in the cube space, like I'm making the vintage cube or the pauper cube or whatever, if they're trying to do something a little bit more creative and off the beaten path, they still often, people will follow this pattern of like, I'm going to pick 10 two-color archetypes and pick my signpost card for each. I mean, I feel like that's another just sort of form of restriction or gimmick. How do you think that fits into this?
Well, that's the thing, is that it's all a big spectrum, right? Like 100 Ornithopters of a Turbo Cube are maybe some of the more extreme examples. I mean, honestly, not even as extreme as like the Bolt Cube or Descent into Avernus.
Yeah.
But on that same spectrum, it's just like Uber Bear's Artifact Cube, right? Like that's just a cube that cares about artifacts, which is on a spectrum from like just completely flavorless, clean magic, regular cube, right? To the most extreme.
Finally, we found a spectrum that the regular cube is not in the middle of.
to the like most extreme out there examples, like the Uber Bear's Artifact Cube is somewhere in the middle, in that it's kind of blurring that line. But I feel like in terms of player perceptions, that it doesn't feel like it's a man. The art for Ward Sliver is really sick. I still have the Scryfall Legion's visual spoiler up, and Ward Sliver has some incredible art. Never seen that one before. I'm not easily distracted. I'm normal.
Man, the original Slivers were cool, I gotta say.
What? Okay, fine.
Should we talk about the Chandelar Slivers?
Fine. Let's take a little detour just to be like, why were all the old, like, what has changed? Old Phyrexians and old Slivers were so much cooler than new Phyrexians and new Slivers.
I don't know. They stopped hiring Chippy.
I mean, I'm thinking about the Eldrazi, too. Like, the old Eldrazi seems so much cooler than what we're seeing spoiled in Modern Horizons 3 to me. Just flavorfully, art, like... I don't know, is that purely my boomer brain? Or is there actually something that is, like, fundamentally changed?
It could be both.
I don't like not knowing if this is purely a bias of mine. I mean, I do think there's just a cleanliness, a like neuteredness to most modern Magic creative direction that, yeah, I don't know. It feels different. Old Slivers were so cool.
They've gone towards a direction that is much more easy to sort of get a hold on aesthetically and understand and, appeal to people that are maybe less enfranchised. The old Slivers were weird. It's like you look at it and you're like, what is this creature? How does it function? How does this make sense?
Where is its head?
And the, like, bizarreness really appeals to, I think, you and I, but definitely doesn't have the same mass appeal to people who are just going to be like, what? Like, this doesn't resonate with me. It's just a confusing little worm.
Does it not?
Yeah, people like...
I remember being a little kid that was barely invested in Magic and thinking the Slivers were hyper cool, and I don't know if I would think that about modern Slivers or modern Eldrazi or modern Phyrexians.
Sorry, I'm just looking at Slivers now.
I just keep looking at Ward Sliver. Good job, Pete Venters. High five to you. Sick art. That's going to be really good art for the background of the page of this episode, too. That, like, tricolor scheme around the border.
You ever just sort a Scryfall search by date and just look at the progression of the illustration style?
Yes, often.
Great. Wow, the first Sliver. Armor Sliver. This guy looks weird.
Anyway, now that we're well and truly distracted, what I was going to say is that another manifestation of this I remember from CubeCon last year is I was on the coverage team and I was also just, otherwise paying attention to see what cubes some of the, like, premier competitive skilled players were drafting at that event. Like, what is Reed Duke choosing to play? And I noticed that pound for pound, maybe with the one exception of Dom Harvey, who also is like deeply invested in Cube in addition to being a competitive grinder and a very skilled player, it seemed like, the Reed Dukes and the Sam Blacks of the world were mostly sticking to cubes that did not appear to have any kind of gimmick. I guess what I'm really trying to get in the head of is like that judgment that, again, I myself have evidence before. Like, I definitely have seen someone's cube idea and been like, okay, sounds cool and new, but, like, not for me, or not for me right now, or I don't want to think about it. I don't have to, like, figure that out. I'm trying to figure out how to, like, hack that perception, that, like, judgment people sometimes have of a cube like the Turbo Cube or like 100 Ornithopters, where the presumption is just because there is something at the surface level that is immediately digestible, there must not be anything under the surface. Like, how do you communicate that, like, there's something at the surface
100
level...
Ornithopters, but good.
100 Ornithopters, but it's actually really interesting. And to be clear, I'm not even sure the 100 Ornithopter Cube is that. It might not be. Like, we've only drafted it twice. It may be that after 5 or 10 drafts, the play group's like, yeah, we kind of solved that. It's not that interesting anymore. The Turbo Cube has had legs, as you've mentioned. Like, that I don't think is going anywhere in terms of its interest. Like, maybe it is a little bit myopic or generous to suggest it, but I feel like the success in messaging has, like, led to a assumption that it doesn't have depth. Where if the 100 Ornithopter Cube had some different name and was just, like, more inscrutable, I think people would look at it and wonder, like, it comes down to, like, the pure, like, high-level question. If you look at a thing and you wonder, why does it exist, right? If I look at a cube that's got 100 Ornithopters, I can think, well, this exists because it's a silly idea, and someone wanted to see what would happen if it pursued this silly idea. If I look at a cube named, the Bedalian Cube or regular cube or Bud Magic Cube, I'm like, why does this exist? Nothing about this is explaining itself at a high level to me. You have to assume there's some deeper thing there that has caused the person to bring this into existence. And that, like, fundamental tension of, like, I want to make a thing with depth, but also be able to communicate it quickly without people assuming that because it was able to be communicated on a surface level, it must lack depth.
I mean, I think that's just going to be a trade-off, and I don't think there's a solution to that, really, unfortunately.
Episode over.
Great.
We're done.
We did it.
You seem to bristle at the idea of describing decisions around cube design as a concession to marketing. And obviously, I hate the term marketing, and I hate marketers. And if you're a marketer listening, I'm sorry, but I don't like your job.
That's an important distinction. You don't like their job. They might be nice people.
I'm sure you're a fine person.
Intentions.
Most people have jobs that are awful because that's the nature of the world we live in. But I understand bristling at the idea that like this world that maybe we both have a little bit of disdain for might have purchase in our beautiful little creative pursuit. But I do think that it is actually fundamentally important to how like a cube is perceived. I think there's a difference between setting expectations and marketing a cube. And like the regular cube, you set perfect expectations about, but you, to your point, have made a conscious effort to like never do anything to market it. You're like, yeah, too bad. Like, I am not going to try to make this appealing to you under any circumstances. Like, if you want to play it, great. Here, I'll set expectations about what you're going to do, but like, you are not going out of your way to make it seem appealing to anybody by choice. I think a lot of people listening probably would be well served to go out of the way to make their cube appealing and understandable to people, though.
Yeah, I mean, that's maybe just me being a jerk and just like reacting to the idea of marketing. Because
it's you being a little manic pixie dream, Anthony.
Yeah, I don't know.
You're
it's
weird.
tough.
You're not like other cube designers. You crush beers and watch sports, not like other cube designers.
Yeah, I've not watched a sport. All right, so we've talked a lot about gimmicks that we have done. Are there other gimmicks on your horizon, like stuff that you're thinking about trying in the future?
There's nothing on the horizon for me other than 100 ornithopters.
You're just fully ornithopter brained.
I'm fully ornithopter pilled right now. I'm in the deep depths of working on this cube. The last thing I want to talk about, as it pertains to this idea of gimmicks and novelties and marketing an idea, is I think the most obvious and bright success in this regard in Magic in maybe ever, but definitely recent history, which is Dan Dan. Dan Dan is one of these completely novel, gimmicky types of ways to play Magic that like is in this completely rogue space where it's not compatible with any constructed Magic, anything people are used to playing, and achieved virality basically, which then eventually led to the Ristic Studies video, which now means it has this like lasting, I think, impact that it wouldn't have if not for Sam's video about it. But it led to this, like, it was like the Macarena of, you know, of Magic projects, for lack of a better word, of the past few years.
Yeah, and I mean, I think to your point, the fact that it has a sort of funny name is essential to its success.
Oh, yeah, the fact that it is built around a utterly stupid card that
is called Dan Dan.
That has Island Home and is called Dan Dan, like, is absolutely fundamental to its success. And I want to give a shout out to Judge Bones' Drake, which is a mono green. Even call it a Dan Dan variant seems like it's, you know, unfair. It's a mono green battle box of similar restrictions to Dan Dan. The only creatures are Uktabi Drake instead of Dan Dan's. But yes, I think that is absolutely fundamental to its success. Have you ever played a game of Dan Dan?
I have.
Okay. Because I feel like you, at least when the idea was first brought up to you, were kind of like, correct me if I'm wrong, I feel like you had the like high-level judgment of like, this is just a thing people are into because of this gimmick, and it's probably not that interesting to actually play.
Yeah, I don't want to be critical of Dan Dan because everybody loves it, but
You
I
can be
found it a
critical of
little
the thing
bit
everyone
stressful playing all these blue cards and playing flashback cards with a shared graveyard. That was stressful for me.
I think you'd be more of a Drake fan, having looked at the Drake list.
I've also played Drake.
I have not played Drake. Did you get to play with Bones at CubeCon?
I did.
I'm jealous. Did you like Drake more?
Yes. Yeah. No, I haven't really thought about that comparison before, but yes. I mean, I like these because they're just like, it's a self-contained little thing. You throw it in your bag and you have a little bit of downtime between rounds. You can play some Dan Dan or some Drake, but they are a little bit about the novelty, and it's about sort of seeing these like weird interactions come up, like, oh, I can crystal spray your Dan Dan, and that's something funny, or use Piracy Charm in a way that I wouldn't usually, but they don't necessarily have the depth that, you know, drafting a more typical cube provides for me.
Or compare it to your like evergreen battle box, right? You have a very simple battle box right now. It's pretty small. What is it, like 150 cards?
Something like that, yeah.
And it just consists of, it's the regular cube of battle boxes, right? It
Yes.
consists of like even much lower power level, just hill giants and grizzly bears and combat tricks and the occasional removal spell. Your suggestion is that that does have more depth than a Dan Dan or a Drake.
I mean, I think a lot of this is also going to be personal taste, but for me, yes.
It's funny to me how much these things, I think, and maybe you and I are just too fundamentally hipster to like weigh in on this, but it feels to me like at some point these things become a little bit a victim of their own success. I feel like you would perceive Dan Dan differently if like someone came up to you at an event and was like, hey, I have this thing I've been working on that you've never heard of before that just like is the thing that they've been like brewing. Do you want to play with me? Versus like the thing that has a bunch of videos about it and all these people on Twitter are talking about how cool it is, and it's like, you know, it's Dan Dan. It's like the Macarena, right? Like, I feel like at some point these things, the success sells them a little bit short, I guess, in some ways.
What I'm hearing is I'm a jaded hipster, and I accept that criticism.
Wait, you're saying you are a jaded hipster, or I'm a jaded hipster?
Well, probably both.
Probably both of us. I did not know the term hipster until I got to art school, and then it was like all of a sudden the most socially weighty descriptor for like any, like it was like the most important thing to be or not to be or to like understand in our like little community in art school, which was so weird to me.
And you didn't even have a mustache back then.
It's true. I was definitely not a hipster back then. I was like, I always joke, it's in my Twitter bio, I was the jock of art school. Like I was the normiest, I was the normiest art school student there was. Do you think the designer of a battle box, a new micro format like Dan, a cube, should care about how popular it is in this broader sense? Should your goal be, if there's listeners out there that are making their own little micro formats, do you think that it's a worthy thing to strive for to be the next Dan? I mean, obviously, to say it this way, there's nothing to be gained financially from this. It's not like that kind of success means anything in like material terms to anybody, right? It would just be recognition for a creative idea you had, which is really valuable to me and many other people. Do you think that's a worthy thing to strive for? Do you think people should actively not strive for that? What's your relationship to that kind of like perception amongst the player base of the thing you've designed?
Wow, that is too big of a question.
I mean, you've explicitly strived not for that, like strive to avoid that with the regular cube. We said it earlier in this episode. You like don't want people to like it for the wrong reasons. Is that a way to say it? Like you don't want people to like it because of some shallow idea versus all the depth and like care you've put into actually balancing that list and like embodying the type of magic you like?
Yeah, I don't know how to approach this question, because the question of like what do we value as a people is a big and personal question that everybody's going to have different responses to. And
what do you think people should value?
I don't want to answer that question.
The people are dying to know, Anthony. They just want you to tell them what to value. Come on.
I mean, for me, it's just like I know that I can get into a bad place with like focusing too much on the upvotes on Twitter, and if I'm just like too much comparing how many followers do I have on Cube Cobra versus the next cube down or up, that's just not a healthy place for me to be. So like for me personally, no, I don't want to value that. On the other hand, getting that sort of recognition for doing creative stuff that is appreciated is really valuable. So both? Neither?
A perfect Anthony answer.
Great.
I felt a little bit of this because I did a tweet 2 weeks ago on Cube Night of just, the Ornithopter Cube, which I've tweeted about it a few times before, but as is the way with social media, for some reason this tweet got retweeted by a couple of people in the right spots and like went a little mini viral in like our little tiny magic corner. And as a result, I, for like 24 hours, had a bunch of replies that were all people like, this cube is so sick, I'm going to build it, which is great. I love hearing that. But also, part of me was like,
wait,
maybe build a better one? Like, this is the first version of this cube, and it's kind of messy. And also, looking at a lot of these people, some people were even saying like, I've kind of wanted the Indie Cube and never found one that was right for me, but this is the one. And I'm like, should this be the one? Should you maybe like build the regular cube first, right? Like, people's eagerness to adopt a thing that is... And again, I hope that the Ornithopter Cube ends up being deep because I've spent a bunch of time acquiring all the stupid cards for it, that I'd like it to actually have some replay value and be more on the Turbo Cube spectrum than the Monoblack Cube spectrum. But I guess it felt to me like some of the responses I get to the Ornithopter Cube are like selling the idea of cube short, where it's like a cube can only be the vintage cube or some gimmick. There is no... in-between space, and that's the space that I think is actually the most rich and valuable and deep and most worthy of exploration, is everything between a gimmick and the MTGO Vintage Cube. But I think there's a lot of people that are like, they look at Cube and they're like, well, I can't afford the Magic Online Vintage Cube because it costs $1 zillion, and I don't want to play Pauper. I mean, that's why the Pauper and Peasant Cubes, like the canonical Pauper and Peasant Cubes, I think are very popular, because it gives people a thing to like latch onto. I guess some of these responses, I was like, just wishing that people would broaden their horizons for their idea of what cube can be, instead of being immediately excited by what is on its surface a gimmick, just having 100 Ornithopters.
Yeah, and I think it just takes a lot of effort to sort of create that variety. I mean, Cube is great because we don't sit down and draft the same thing every time. And
Cube is great. You're right.
Gimmicks are going to be helpful in creating some of that variety, but they're kind of just sort of like the signpost or the benchmarks, and in between it, that's all new space that these gimmicks open up.
You asked me this question earlier. Do you feel like there are any novel or gimmick cubes on your horizon? Maybe not even a specific idea, but like your relationship to the idea of a like gimmick to hook people. Does that feel like a thing you are more excited to pursue? Or, I mean, as somebody who talked, last episode about how a lot of Magic is not that exciting to you right now, you're feeling checked out, like, how does the idea of like a radical novelty relate to that? Does it divorce you from that churn more, so you're more excited by the prospect of that? Or is it like just more of the same?
No, I mean, I think that a lot of these kind of gimmicky things can be really valuable in just drastically sort of shaking up your perspective and approach to things. And it is pretty rewarding to sit down at, somebody else has built this cube that functions very differently in our local play group and just look at cards differently or look at cards I've never seen before. I also feel like, as we were talking about last week, just a little bit overwhelmed by just the constant mass of new cards. So for me, it's kind of like, how do I strike that balance between appreciating the novelty without just being overwhelmed by novelty in the sense of like new stuff I have to learn, and is this actually fun and exciting? So I definitely am excited to see more of the novel things that other people in our playgroup are doing. I'm sure I will come around to coming up with some other novel restriction like the Turbo Cube, but probably not in the super near future.
That's something I do think just practically, as someone that owns 4 cubes now? 3? Wait, what? Bun Magic? No, 4 cubes. As someone that owns 4 cubes now, I practically feel very much more excited by a cube where I know that, obviously you're never compelled to look through all of spoiler season, but where I know that I can look at a very small subset of new cards that are actually in consideration to like continue to keep the cube maintained, which is true of all of my non-Bun Magic cubes, right? Like the Neoclassical cube almost never gets updates from new sets unless those new cards happen to like fit in this perfect spot and use old mechanics and have old school vibes, right? Like a handful at most of any set would even be passingly considerations. The Degenerate Microcube is a small cube that focuses on very specific stuff that means that very few cards in new sets are relevant to it. I think the same is going to be true for the 100 Ornithopters cube. Like, it just cares about a very specific type of card, and
An Ornithopter specifically.
well, yes, but also like 100 cards in that list are never going to change, and there's also 60 lands in it, and so you're down to like, okay, there's really only 200 other cards in the list, so it's also a smaller cube in that sense, and it's very easy to identify when a new set is released the cards that could potentially work under these new radical considerations. I think if people out there are like interested in pursuing a more novel space in cube design, I would really think about something that, whether it's a rules modification or just a byproduct of the construction of the cube itself, that dramatically shifts card evaluation. Because looking at spoilers through the lens of a Turbo Cube is exciting every time. Even if you're like kind of checked out of spoiler season, it's like fun to be like, oh, here are the ones that are like, what does this do in the Turbo Cube? Like, is this broken? That's a fun game that it's not even the cube that I maintain, and I play that game every spoiler season. I think the same can be true for the 100 Ornithopters cube, and I think the fact that that's not that true for like the Monoblack Cube is a good example of why that idea maybe just didn't have as much legs for you, because it's like, yeah, okay, there's more black cards every set, and some of them are good. I guess we can decide how they fit, as opposed to being like, this card is radically different over here.
Right. I mean, it's sort of describing the same experience of like, what's it like to open up a pack and have this recontextualization is similar to the experience of, as the cube designer, being like, okay, what are these new cards that potentially are interesting in this space?
We should describe them as context shift cubes rather than
cubes.
Novelty or gimmick cubes. And then what's it going to take for us to get Reed Duke to want to draft one of these at CubeCon? That's my final question.
I would love to see like a bunch of really top level players draft the Turbo Cube, and I wonder if it would look drastically different, and also how bad of a time they would have.
I'm fully projecting here, obviously, because I've not talked to Reed or Sam about this at all, but like part of my assumption maybe for why they don't play those cubes is that they're just like, well, I'm not going to get to express my skill because somebody else who just knows this gimmick more than I do is going to like have an edge over me. Whereas in a regular,
believe that a bit.
You don't believe they think that?
I think Sam Black will see right through everything and understand how to draft it.
I think he would too, but I also think that where Sam gets a lot of joy in drafting a set is seeing through the matrix when the matrix is not in your face. It's like he's doing that in the regular cube too. He's like, looking through, reading between lines and like figuring out what the actual underlying motivators are, as opposed to being like the like level 1 of read this card and the cost is reduced by 2. Like, okay, great, it's powerful now. Like, I get that. I don't know, maybe I'm wrong, but I think if we can like get to a place, broadly speaking, as like a Magic community where the most skilled spiky players are also interested in spiking radically different contexts of Magic, that would be a good place for us all to be vibing. All right, Anthony, let's close out here on a Pack One Pick One from the 100 Ornithopters Cube, maybe to demonstrate this radical context shift.
All right, let's do it.
I'm doing it in paper. I just got the cube right in front of me, so I pulled 15 random cards, and here they are in order. The pack is Embercleave, Ornithopter number 19, Tameo Collector of Tails, Aggravated Assault, Ornithopter number 47, Holdout Settlement, Mox Opal, Diabolic Intent, Draconic Destiny, Scale Up, Wooded Foothills, Ornithopter number 83, Ornithopter number 45, Culling the Weak, and Hallowed Fountain.
All right, so we got 4 Ornithopters. I think the best number is...
Is that the average number of Ornithopters? But there are 24 packs, so yeah, that's exactly average number of Ornithopters for a pack.
All right, we haven't done a Pack One Pick One in forever. How do we even do this?
First you say, there's a lot of things I'm looking at here.
Okay, there's a lot of things I'm looking at here. We got a Scale Up. This was in my deck that I drafted last time, so I'm drawn to it because I actually only cast it like one time, maybe.
I really regret not taking that in that draft where I ended up going 1-2. We were across the table from each other, and I was also in similar colors. And
Perfect, that means we did it right?
Yeah, except you did it better because you 3-0'd and I went 1-2. But I remember looking at the Scale Up and thinking, nah, I think I need another Ornithopter. And then at the end of the draft, really wishing I had Scale Up.
It's kind of a level 1 strategy if this is how you're going to kill people. Maybe that's the way to sort this is like, all right, we got a couple Ornithopters. I'm not Pack One Pick One-ing an Ornithopter. We got Embercleave and Scale Up, but Embercleave, you kind of need other things to go with it. I think and we have 1 fixing land. We have a Wooded Foothills.
There's a Hallowed Fountain in there too.
And a Hallowed Fountain and a Holdout Settlement. We got 3 fixing lands.
Holdout Settlement, I think, pretty good here, to be honest. Like, maybe a higher pick than a fetch land if you're looking to pick a fixing land.
All right, but I think I'm between Mox Opal, so we got the Metalcraft Mox, or Diabolic Intent. I've found in these drafts that because my deck sort of hinged on really key pieces to work, that a tutor is going to be really good here. Yeah, I'm taking that Diabolic Intent.
It's the Mox Opal for me. I actually kind of think maybe Mox Opal's too good for this cube.
That's very possible.
And the reason why is, like, in this cube, Mox Opal is very close to just a 5-color Mox. You can very easily build a deck that can turn on Metalcraft on turn 1 trivially. The other thing is that I think mana is very often the bottleneck here because, well...
You say that, but all my creatures cost 0.
Well, I guess it's your creatures cost 0, but the things that are going to actually make them relevant tend to cost 3 for the most part. Like, 3 is kind of the sweet spot of, like, okay, now this game is really proceeding to an end state, right? That's where you get your Curse of Predations, your Beastmaster's Ascension, your Aura Shards, like, that kind of stuff is all at 3. There are some things at 2 that are worth playing Ornithopters for.
All the glitters?
All the glitters is a great example.
really carried me last draft.
I really was impressed by Military Intelligence, which is just a 2-mana blue enchantment that says when you attack with 2 or more creatures, you draw a card, which in this cube just means you get to draw a card every subsequent turn if you have 2 Ornithopters in your opening hand. So there are certainly some 2-mana cards and 1-mana cards that are worth playing Ornithopters early, and that was by design, but it still really feels like 3 is that sweet spot, which is why I think that, like, Ancient Tomb is a really high pick in this cube. Perhaps paradoxically, because you're like, well, my creatures don't cost any mana, why do I care about having more mana? It's because getting to drop Curse of Predation on turn 2 instead of turn 3 is a huge difference.
Fair.
So, because of how important mana is here, and because it is kind of trivially easy to make Mox Opal just broken, like better than any other actual normal Mox, I'm on that. And I kind of think I might cut it eventually for just being too good. It's just, people get excited when they see Mox Opal because they're like, I can turn on Metalcraft immediately.
Yeah. And also, even in addition to the Ornithopters, there's just a lot of other cards that are artifacts because you don't have a bunch of other creatures, and you have a lot of artifacts that are going to make your Ornithopters be able to kill your opponent.
Embercleave.
Like Embercleave.
Trample ends up really mattering here, too.
Yeah, definitely.
Tons of chump blockers, so Kessig Wolfrun, Embercleave, don't sleep on them. I think it's worth acknowledging the Aggravated Assault in that pack, which is the combo card. There are quite a few ways you can end up producing mana with your Ornithopters, which means you can then just take infinite combat steps, and all you need is a way to get in 1 damage, and you can just kill your opponent that way. I wouldn't take it this highly. I would take the Diabolic Intent over that if I wanted to be a combo deck, because a tutor for a piece is a little more valuable than committing to a hard piece for a combo deck pack 1, but that's the other direction you can go with this. No one's playing a fair Aggravated Assault in this cube.
I'd try it.
I appreciate that. I appreciate your openness. And on that bombshell, that concludes this episode of Lucky Paper Radio. As a reminder, we have a P.O. Box. You can send us physical mail to P.O. Box 4855, Baltimore, Maryland, 21211. So far, only Joe has sent us mail, other than people that have sent me cards for the... No, we got a postcard, too. So far, only Joe and one other person has sent us mail. Joe, we have your other letter. It's sitting here. I'm just waiting till we get a couple more things before we do another mailbag segment. So hold tight. And listeners, if you want to know what Joe's letter contains, you got to send us something else. That's the only way. All the music for this show is produced by DJ James Nasty. All the Magic cards are produced by Wizards of the Coast. This show is produced by Anthony and I, thinking really hard about Magic cards and then speaking into microphones about it. Nice job on your 3-0 of the Ornithopter Cube.
Thank you.
You did kind of
fun.
subvert another nickname I had to save for you, which was going to be Namer of the First Ornithopter.
Yeah.
But now we kind of already talked about that, so it's not really interesting. So I'll scratch that one off the list.